Hey everybody, this video is going to go over the PowerPoint in the week 2 module on fallacies. So in week 2 we've already talked about claims and proofs. So your claim is your assertion, the statement that you are trying to persuade your audience to agree with. Your support and proofs is how you're going to get them to agree with you. And fallacies are very much related to that support and proof. During that lesson on support and proof, we talked about how important it is to have really strong, ethical, convincing support for your claim. But we run into a problem sometimes, and even if we don't commit this error ourselves, we need to be aware of these errors that we're about to talk about in other people's arguments. Because part of being good at presenting your own argument is being able to critically analyze someone else's argument. And we need to be aware that some arguments are not playing by the rules, if you will. All right, so that's what we're going to talk about in this video is fallacies and ethical argument. So what are fallacies? Well, a fallacy is something that looks like a proof and acts like a proof, but isn't really a proof. It's not really true support. It's what we call pseudo-proof. Pseudo meaning fake. And you can have fake proof because it's flawed, perhaps. Maybe it's the support you're trying to present really isn't related to the claim directly. Maybe it's skewed in some way. The information is altered to fit a certain point of view. Maybe it's inadequate. Maybe it's not enough. It could be downright false. It could be totally incorrect, or it could be misrepresented and misinterpreted in some way. So that's what a fallacy is, pseudo-proof, fake proof. Looks and sounds like proof, acts like proof, but when you look closely, it's really not. And it can really have a powerful effect if you're using fallacies or someone else is using fallacies and the audience isn't picking up on the fallacies, okay? And there are fallacies in all three categories of proofs. There's fallacies in ethos, logos, and pathos. So we're going to talk about the most common ones in all three categories. All right, so fallacies in ethos. Remember, ethos is all about character. The first one is the most common ethos fallacy, and it's what we call ad hominem. That is Latin for to the man, and it's basically an attack on a person's character rather than a person's ideas or policies. So instead of meeting their argument head on, you bypass the argument and you just start attacking them, their character. It's often seen in politics. I know we've all noticed it. We all know what this is. And it's where, you have one candidate going up against another candidate, and candidate A is obviously trying to beat candidate B and trying to convince voters to vote for him instead of candidate B. But instead of talking about candidate B's policies, their ideas, and how his own ideas, how candidate A's ideas are better, candidate A just completely bypasses that part of the argument and starts saying nasty things about candidate B. And it directs our attention away from the issues at hand, and it causes us to start to see candidate B as just a bad person. And if we're not careful, you can be swayed by this, even though all of us know that that's wrong. We all know that it should be about the job and what each candidate is offering and what their ideas and policies are. But when you have people who are really good at persuasion, you can find yourself being misled and led astray from the issues at hand. It happens often in politics again, but you can find it even outside of politics. So attacking a person's character, the opponent's character, even if it's a group, like not just one person as the opponent, but a group of people who are opposing your point of view, attacking that group is also ad hominem. It's something that we should avoid when we're making our own arguments, and something we should always be on the lookout for when we're hearing or reading someone else's argument. Another ethos fallacy is guilt by association. We know what this is as well. You know, birds of a feather flock together. So if you have any kind of ties or associations with a person or group who might seem unsavory in some way to the audience, someone will use that against you. And I think this is one that's much easier to fall victim to. I think that it's really human nature to think that if you have associations of some sort with a bad group, that you must share some similar qualities with that group. And it can be easy to fall victim to guilt by association. But you know, when we're talking about academic argument and when we're talking about important arguments, guilt by association is something that, you know, if you're gonna go that route and it be real and it be valid, you better have proof that the the the, the person or your opponent really does share the same qualities and ideas and beliefs and behaviors that this unsavory group does. Just because they go to the same gym or that they frequent the same restaurants, or that they go to, you know, they go out to dinner. You know, you can't just automatically assume anything about anybody based on the people they hang out with, even though it's so easy to do that. But when we're talking about real argument, we have to be very careful of how much we let ourselves be led astray like that. And if you are the one making the argument, again, don't try to beat your opponent or try to, you know, crush the opposition by using guilt by association unless you have real proof that that association is more than just association, right? Another fallacy of ethos is using authority instead of evidence. So we're relying on personal authority instead of actual evidence to prove a point. Like, you know, well, I'm the president of such and such club, so whatever I say must be correct. You should agree with me because, you know, I hold this position. And that's really easy to see why it would be a poor choice. You know, you can anyone can hold any position and still we don't have to agree with them. And even in a not so serious manner, you can think of how advertising used celebrities so much in their campaigns. And it's almost like just because this celebrity wears this brand or drinks this drink or, you know, whatever, that we should too. You know, and there's really not much said about the product itself because the company, the advertising company, and the product company, they're just hoping that we'll buy into it based on the celebrity whose face is associated with it, right? All right. Now we're going to move on to some fallacies in pathos. Remember, pathos is emotion. So what kinds of things can be done to twist an argument involving emotions? So the first is bandwagon appeal, and we all know what this is. Everyone else is doing it, so you should too. It's obviously used quite heavily in advertising, but it's also used in politics and just straight up public opinion. Gosh, oh, Lord have mercy. Fallacies and pathos are rampant in social media for sure. So you can get on any social media site and any kind of discussion, whether it's serious and like politics and world issues down to the most minute things, trivial things. You will run into so many people who will try to make their point by saying, well, you know, everybody else feels this way. Everybody else does it this way. So it must be right. No. Slippery slope is another fallacy in pathos. And, you know, if you think about what a slippery slope is, you start out up here and you start going down and then it's really slippery and all of a sudden you just tumbled down the entire hill. So what this means in terms of argument, it's kind of a scare tactic. So if we let this one thing happen, it's all going to fall like dominoes. And before you know it, the world's going to be in ruins. If we allow one thing to happen, disaster is around the corner. Often used in politics and in propaganda, just something we're going to look at a little later on. The slippery slope fallacy is a very popular one, and it's easy to see why humans fall victim to it, and because we do often go to worst case scenario, right? But that's not necessarily accurate, Another fallacy in pathos is creating false needs, right? Emotion, right? You're gonna make the audience feel like they need something when really they don't. It's going to be an unrealistic heightening of an existing need. And the best example of this is everything in advertising. They make us feel like we need this new mascara. They make us feel like we need this new car with all the amenities. They make us feel like we need to go out and buy all these different products, and really we don't. We don't need any of it, but they make us feel like we do. Another fallacy in pathos is a distorted emotional appeal. It's when you're using emotional examples to prove or highlight a point, but which is in and of itself not a bad thing. That's not the fallacy. It's when that emotional example isn't really related to the argument at hand, to the claim. And or when the proportion of the emotional appeal is too much, when it has gone over the top. And one example I can give of this is like the commercials for the SPCA, where they're showing all the sad animals in the shelters, and they have that Sarah McLachlan song, The Arms of the Angel, I believe is the one, playing in the background, and it's just so sad and so depressing and really pulls at your heartstrings. And certainly there might be days where that kind of emotional appeal would work on me. They just reel me right in. But most of the time when I personally see that distorted emotional appeal, it immediately turns me off. And whereas I might have actually listened and considered doing something, if they had come at it with a little more rationality, just toned it down a bit, but because they went over the top with that emotional appeal, they lost me. But that's not necessarily the case for everyone else. Those distorted emotional appeals can be very powerful, but be aware of them, okay? Then there's also the golden age fallacy. This is an appeal to emotions because it appeals to our sense of nostalgia. It characterizes the past as being so much better than the present, but it completely ignores or conveniently forgets that there were bad things about the past as well. And I give an example on that slide. Life today would be so much better. There'd be less crime, less poverty, less illicit behavior if we still lived like we did in the 1950s, right? So golden age fallacy. 4 or 5 decades ago, things were so much better. And if we could just go back to that time, life would be infinitely better today than it is right now. But it just conveniently forgets the fact that during the 50s, there was a lot of violence. We were at war. There was rampant racism. I mean, the 50s were really not all that great for a good chunk of Americans. So that golden age fallacy isn't really proof. It does not explore that past fully enough. Now we get into all of the fallacies in logos. Remember, logos is logic, and oh my goodness, there are so many. And they're pretty popular. You'll see them in a lot of uh, contexts, a lot of different places once you start being aware of them and kind of looking for them. The first one we're going to talk about is what we call begging the question. So you're asked a question, you you give an answer, but the answer really, the support you give doesn't really um, answer it. It's basically like you just restated the question. So I give two examples on the slide. Capital punishment deters crime because it keeps criminals from committing murder. Well, that didn't really answer the question, though. You know, why does capital punishment deter crime? It deters crime because it keeps them from committing murder. That's not really an answer. Same thing with the second example. Low voter turnout is a result of fewer people going to the polls. Well, duh. You haven't really answered the question, though, of why fewer people are going to the polls. Begging the question. Circular logic. Another logos fallacy is what we call the straw man fallacy. So the straw man fallacy is where you attribute some sort of claim or argument to an opponent, but the opponent never actually made that statement or made that argument. But you somehow make it seem like they did, and then you stand there and you give all of this evidence to refute the opponent's argument, and you just crush them. But they never really said those things in the first place. That they never made those statements, they never made that argument. You just conflated it. Maybe you took a statement out of context, blew it out of proportion, and then just annihilated them with all of this counter argument. But it wasn't really there. So it's almost like you have to invent this argument that your opposition made so you can knock them down because you're not confident enough in your own argument. You're not confident enough in your ability to win, if you will. So you have to create this imaginary argument that you can use to win, but it's not real. None of it's real. Another fallacy in logos is what we call a non sequitur. And non sequitur is Latin for it does not follow. So basically, you have this statement, this claim that's being made, and the support that's being used just does not match up with the claim. It doesn't. There's no real connection. It's almost illogical. So I give two examples of this as well. The professor in the Hawaiian shirt and gold chains must be an easy grader. Why? And then they're trying to imply that the professor would be an easy grader because of the Hawaiian shirt and gold chains. And see, it just doesn't make any sense. It's totally illogical. Or the beautiful woman who applied to be our secretary clearly wouldn't do the job well. Why not? Because she's beautiful? That doesn't make any sense either. So that's the kind of statement we're talking about with a non sequitur. It's when the support that's being supplied really just has nothing to do with the claim that's being made. Doesn't match up. It doesn't follow. It's almost nonsensical in some ways. Then we have what we call a red herring. So a red herring pulls away, it provides irrelevant support or misleading support, and it pulls the audience away from the real argument. It's almost like a sleight of hand or a smoke and mirrors kind of trick. It's a distraction over here. So the example I give is, I don't believe we should elect this candidate because she would have to put her kids in daycare. Well, putting her kids in daycare is the red herring. She's probably a very strong candidate, right? Has a lot of potential. And instead of dealing with the issues and focusing on that, you're drawing the reader or the audience's attention away. And it's not a slam on her character, so it's not ad hominem. You're not distracting us in that way. You're distracting us by making us focus on another issue but it's not an important issue. It has nothing to do with the argument at hand. Okay. So another fallacy in logos is what we call stacked evidence. And this is why we talk so much about, and we're going to talk about so much about engaging the opposition, and why in the course project you will be required to have at least one source that supports an opposing idea, an opposing claim to your claim. Because if you don't show anything else except the support that backs up your point of view, it's what we call stacked evidence. You're only representing one side of the issue. You're completely omitting evidence from the opposing side. And that's not fair. That's not ethical. You have to present the opposing point of view and even point out when they may have valid claims. It's not going to take anything away from your argument if your argument is strong. Yeah, sure, they make a few good points here, but I still have more good points, and my stance is still stronger than theirs, despite the fact that they have a few, valid claims here and there, right? But you have to show the opposition. Otherwise, it's stacked evidence, and that's a big logical fallacy. You'll see that a lot too. And manufactured evidence, it's literally fake. And I hope I don't really need to explain why that would be a fallacy, why that would be unethical in argument, to just completely manufacture evidence. That's not to say it doesn't happen on a regular basis, because it certainly does. But we're better than that, right? And we're not going to commit that fallacy. All right. Then we have unreliable or insufficient evidence. So unreliable evidence, evidence has to be verifiable. It has to be found in other sources. If you take a study, like an article published about a study that showed these crazy results, and you use that as the foundation of your support, but that study has only been done that one time, has never been repeated, or maybe they've even tried to repeat it, but they never get the same results, it's insufficient and unreliable. Because it has to be repeatable, and there has to be enough of it, right? You have to have verifiable support. You also cannot have exaggerated or oversimplified evidence. The evidence should be repeatable. It should be substantial and thoroughly examined. And you can't oversimplify it, right? So an example here is handguns should only be sold to good people and not to criminals. That is clearly oversimplifying an issue, and that happens so much in politics and in social media. It's oh my gosh, I wish I could come up with an example right off the top of my head, but I'm drawing a blank right now. It's so pervasive though in our culture to oversimplify an issue. And I guess if I do have one that comes to mind. I don't normally like to go with those really big hot topic issues, but it's an easy one for me to use as an example. Is the pro-life, pro-choice argument. Both sides make valid points, but when it comes to discussing the opposing side's stance, they just completely oversimplify it, and everything is just black and white. There's no gray. You know what I mean? So that takes away all the complexity that's truly there in reality. You also don't want distorted statistics. You don't want to change or manipulate statistics or use them from, from a source that has skewed or manipulated them. They appear to support a claim, but has it been manipulated? So the example I give here is salaries at our company are outstanding. The average salary is $40,000 a year. It's pretty decent, right? But what this statistic doesn't tell us is that, there's only 5 employees. One of them makes $120,000 a year, while the other 4 employees only make 20 grand a year. So by taking that average, and then saying that the average salary is $40,000 a year is really skewed, very much a manipulated statistic. So be aware of that. Okay, I'm not really concerned that any of us would use distorted statistics on purpose intentionally, but you need to be aware that you need to be critical of the sources you use to support your argument in case those sources have manipulated the statistics. Then there is the logical fallacy of a hasty generalization, also so popular, jumping to conclusions, right? It happened once, so we're going to apply it to everything, right? This happens quite a bit. If you're going to say that something is fact or that something is the norm, there has to be enough examples of it. And if there's too few examples and we just jump to conclusions, we're not really being critical about the argument and we're not providing true support for our claim. Right? Then there is the either or fallacy. It's very oversimplified. This kind of goes back to the fallacy we just talked about with oversimplified evidence. It's very similar, but it's when you're presenting an argument and making the reader or the audience feel like it's this or this. It's either or. There's no compromise. There's no gray area. There's no middle ground. There's no compromise. So some examples that I gave, we can develop either a strong space program or an urban development program. And it's like, really? Are those really our only 2 options? Probably not. I bet there's some middle ground there. A woman can either be a mother or have a career. There's no middle ground. A man can either go to graduate school or become a company man. No, I'm pretty sure there's way more options than that. And these seem very like personal examples, but you'll see them even in like arguments that apply to broader issues. Another logical fallacy is what we call post hoc. The full term is post hoc ergo propter hoc, and roughly translated from the Latin, it means after this, therefore because of this. And this is essentially a faulty cause and effect support. So I just give examples here. Advertisements that claim people will be more attractive and popular if they drink a certain brand of soda or beer. It's not truly support to think of that cause and effect as being a true cause and effect relationship. That if you drink this, you'll be more attractive. It does not follow. The outdoor healthy virility of the old Marlboro Man advertising, it suggested that he got that way, being that rugged, masculine man, because he smoked their brand of cigarettes. And obviously, that cause and effect relationship it doesn't even make sense. There is no real cause and effect there. Or finding romance by wearing a certain cologne or certain perfume. There is no cause and effect there. But they make us think there is. And you can see this applied in way more than just advertising. You'll see it applied in politics as well, the post hoc. It's basically faulty cause and effect. So those are all of the most common fallacies in ethos, pathos, and logos. But I also want to talk about a few other types of fallacies that don't really fall neatly into one of those 3 types of proofs. And it's really just all about misusing language. All right. Obfuscation. You do not want to use jargon or these really strange words or phrases that make a simple idea sound way more profound. An example here is, through the fully functional development process of a streamlined target refractory system, the U.S. military will successfully reprioritize its data throughputs. Well, that sounds super impressive, but when I try to figure out what you're actually talking about, it seems like just a bunch of gibberish. They're not actually making a point with that statement. And it's, what are throughputs? What's a, like fully functional development process? So part of that is is knowing not to be too wordy, but certainly don't be wordy to try to mislead or cover up something in your argument. Then there's ambiguity, all right? Statements that can be interpreted in two or more opposite ways. It can be intentional or unintentional. Sometimes it's unintentional with where we place our pronouns in our sentences. Other times it is intentional. But the example here is, many women need to work to support their children through school, but they would be better off at home. They would be better off at home. If we go with the rules of grammar, they refers to children because that's the noun it comes closest to. They would be better off at home. The children would be better off at home. That's what that statement is actually telling us if we look at grammar and mechanics. But is the they actually referring to the women? Are the women better off at home? We don't know. And someone could make that statement, and I could think of it one way, and you would think of it another way, and maybe we're both walking away with the wrong idea. I don't know. Then there's slanted language, choosing words with strong positive and negative connotations. Connotation is the feeling, the emotion, the associations that we give to words. Really easy example here is like just the colors white and black. White, why do we wear white on our wedding days? Because white signifies purity. Black is darkness, right? And then there's obviously the racial undertones with using those colors in other contexts. But so many words in our everyday language have certain connotations to them, things that we associate with them that really have nothing to do with their true dictionary definition. So if you're using a lot of words, if you're choosing a lot of words that have those strong connections to them, positive or negative, you're kind of misleading the reader a little bit, or you're taking a risk that they're going to start associating your claims with some of those connotations. It draws readers away from the true logic, because then you start getting too much of their emotions and their associations involved. An example here is, I am firm. You are obstinate. Just a little bit. That connotation. It's for, even though firm and obstinate pretty much mean the same thing, our connotation is that firm is okay. Obstinate, that's not so good. And then he is pig-headed. Well, that clearly has a negative connotation to it. But all three statements essentially mean the same thing if you look at true definitions of those words. But by choosing each one of them, we bring a certain association to the statement that our readers, that our audience are going to be very aware of. They're going to have that same association more than likely. So be very careful with how you use language, that you're not being unethical with simply your word choice. So fallacies in review here, be aware that there are all different types of fallacies out there. You don't have to necessarily memorize the entire list provided in the PowerPoint, but you do want to familiarize yourself with them, especially, going through the descriptions, the ones that you're like, oh yeah, I've seen that a lot. Maybe kind of try to remember the names of those, for instance, but at least be aware, even if you can't remember the name, like if you're reading an article, you're watching a debate on TV, and you're like, oh my gosh, I know that. He just committed, I know it's a fallacy, I can't remember the name of it, but that was wrong. That was unethical. Be aware that they're out there and that they're used so pervasively throughout our culture. Look for them in anything you read, anything you view. Finding fallacies is a good sign that what you're reading or viewing is flawed in some way, right? And also, of course, be careful that you don't commit these types of fallacies in your own argument, right? I don't think any of us would on purpose. but sometimes, when we get very passionate about a subject, and if you happen to be passionate about the topic you choose for the course project, then you might find yourself veering down the road of fallacies, at least, some of them. So just be careful to avoid them in your own argument. If you have any questions about the fallacies PowerPoint, let me know. Otherwise, you guys are free to move on to the next item.